keeping up with the Commodore, 'cause the Commodore is keeping up with you.
The Commodore 64, now in a home family pack. A family pack containing the world's #1 selling home computer, a data cassette and joystick, a comprehensive teach-yourself program, plus 3 additional software packages. The Commodore family pack now available from your Commodore dealers and major retail stores. Now that's value for money.
Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you.
Commodore International Corporation was a computer and electronics manufacturer, founded all the way back in 1976. Now, Commodore has a rich and relatively complicated history, since they had their hands in a lot of different markets all over the world, but for a time, they were considered one of the big players in the home computer market. And speaking of computers, you probably use one. Heck, you might be using one right now to watch this. I mean, it's probably some kind of computer, right? Listen, even your smart TV is a computer at this point. You know that. But maybe you're afraid that someone might be watching what you're watching. And I don't mean just a mutual watching thing. I mean watching you with your data or something. Hackers! Ah, scary! But don't worry. You can protect yourself with today's sponsor! Surfshark VPN it's a VPN. Well, you don't know what that is? Listen. It stands for Virtual Private Network. And what it does is establish a digital connection between your computer and a remote server that's owned by the VPN provider, creating a point-to-point tunnel that encrypts your personal data. Most of you are probably aware that data theft and data sales are kind of through the roof online. Like, that's a thing that happens a lot. And you don't want that to happen to you. I don't want that to happen to you. Heck, I don't want that to happen to me. But don't worry, Surfshark helps you protect this by offering you a secure connection to help keep your data, your data. And that's not all a VPN is good for. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, you would like to watch a movie on, say, Netflix. Let's say that's the thing. But Netflix has decided that the movie you want to watch isn't available in your country. How rude. But that's okay. With the click of a button. Oh, look at that. I'm Canadian, eh? Huh? Surfshark not only allows you to use it on unlimited devices, but has over 3,200 servers in 100 different countries and 24/7 customer support. And they don't just offer VPN services at this point. They also have Surfshark antivirus in case you decided to download a really sketchy looking file and suddenly there's a problem. Don't worry, Surfshark can help you, because they're sharks, but like the good kind. Friendly sharks. Happy sharks. Surf sharks! And now, with this extra super awesome offer, you can get a hold of Surfshark by clicking the link in the description of this video and signing up for just $1.99 a month, plus 4 months extra on top of that. And if you are totally satisfied with Surfshark's performance, or what it does for you, or it protecting your data, presumably from hacker dolphins, you have a 30-day money-back guarantee. And that's always nice. We like that. We like guarantees. Anyway, interestingly, Commodore goes back a lot further than the founding of the International Corporation. The name Commodore goes back to Commodore Business Machines. It was founded by 2 men, Jack Tramiel and Manfred Kapp. Remember Tramiel, because he'll come up a lot during this story. These 2 guys had met in the early 1950s while they were employed by the Ace Typewriter Repair Company in New York City. In 1954, they would pool their resources and start selling used and refurbished typewriters. They then turned around using the profits from this outing to purchase the Singer Typewriter Company. They then used profits from that to acquire a local dealership that was selling Everest adding machines. Not typewriters and sort of calculators, but mechanical calculators that were mostly used for bookkeeping. Tramiel managed to convince Everest to give him and Kapp's company exclusive Canadian rights to their products, and then went on to establish Everest office machines in Toronto in 1955. But these guys had gotten into this market relatively late to the party. It's the 50s, and computers were coming into the fold, to a degree. Adding machines were on the way out. By 1958, that particular business was slowing. However, Tramiel had connections, and one of Everest's agents over in England told him about another business opportunity that would allow him to import portable typewriters that were manufactured by a Czechoslovakian company. It was then, in 1958, that Tramiel and Cap incorporated the Commodore Portable Typewriter Company in Toronto to sell those specific typewriters. But they struggled quite a bit early on. They were barely treading water when it came to these sales. So they wound up selling a big portion of the company to Atlantic Acceptance Corporation, which was one of Canada's largest financing companies. And Atlantic's president, C. Powell Morgan, then became the chairman of Commodore. In 1962, they took the company public on the Montreal Stock Exchange, using the name Commodore Business Machines Limited. With this new injection of cash, they were able to expand into a lot of other markets, and they did this quite rapidly throughout the 60s. They purchased a factory in West Germany to build typewriters, and even started supplying office furniture through a Canadian manufacturer. That would do so well that they would wind up purchasing the furniture company. But in 1965, Atlantic Acceptance actually collapsed due to them not making a routine payment. A subsequent investigation would show that there was a massive fraud scheme in place. Atlantic Acceptance had been falsifying financial records in order to acquire loans funneled into a web of subsidiaries, where the aforementioned C. Powell Morgan held a personal stake. He would then pocket that money, or invest it, basically whatever he wanted to do with it. Commodore was directly implicated in the scheme, since Morgan was, of course, the chairman, but the following investigation showed that there had been zero wrongdoing by Tramiel or Cap. They couldn't find any evidence they even knew about the scheme, let alone were involved, so they had no charges filed against them. But this still wasn't good for Commodore. Because Atlantic Acceptance had been their principal investor and owned a significant portion of the company, they were suddenly out a lot of cash. Plus, they had taken out a loan from Atlantic, a pretty major one, in order to purchase an office supply retailer known as Wilson Stationers. Despite not being charged with anything, Tramiel had a lot of trust to build back since people were reluctant to give him any kind of loan. He could only secure a bridge loan by paying a very high interest rate and putting the German factory up as collateral. This is where another man would enter the fray, an individual named Irving Gould. Gould was a financier, and he was working with Tramiel to try to help him deal with this issue. Gould was able to broker a deal to sell Wilson Stationers over to an American company. That netted Commodore quite a bit of extra cash they desperately needed at the time, but then that meant that Commodore owed Gould for dealing with that, and they didn't have sufficient capital to meet those payments. Tramiel managed to work something out with Gould, however. He sold 17.9% of the company over to Gould in 1966 for $500,000, and as part of the arrangement, Gould would become the company's new chairman. But for a time, it was pretty much only uphill from here. Tramiel and Gould would work together quite well for a while, and one of the things Tramiel was interested in starting to sell were calculators. Basically, more modern adding machines. They were digital and could be made smaller. He would see some of the first offerings in this department through contacts he had over in the Japanese market. Seeing this as the future when it came to anything adding machine related, he pivoted from those old school things to marketing these modern calculators, produced by companies like Casio, but under Commodore's brand name. Later, though, in 1969, Commodore started manufacturing their own electronic calculators. And they started doing well. Really well. By the early 70s, they had a profitable line and were one of the more popular brands. They began to develop their technology further, creating both consumer-grade basic calculators as well as scientific and programmable calculators. That made them a tidy profit for a few years, but then in 1975, Texas Instruments would step in. Prior to that, they had been the leading supplier of calculator components, including ones that Commodore was using. And they decided that they were just going to make their own calculators using components that they made, and therefore, their calculators could be a lot cheaper. Indeed, Texas Instruments calculators were both of good quality and priced less than Commodore's. This was a major problem as they suddenly started losing money. Gould would have to invest further from his own funds, and Tramiel used that money to purchase several second-source chip suppliers, including MOS Technology Incorporated. This ensured Commodore's own supply of components that they desperately needed, so they no longer had to rely on Texas Instruments, and MOS was a semiconductor design and fabrication company based in Pennsylvania. MOS hadn't been doing so hot, and he only agreed to buy them because he wanted one of their employees, their chip designer, Chuck Peddle. Tramiel recognized Chuck's talent and wanted him to be the head of engineering over at Commodore. This was agreed upon, and in 1976, Commodore Business Machines was dissolved and replaced by a new corporation known as Commodore International. That entity was now the parent company of all the Commodore Group. Whether you were over in Germany or whether you were in Japan or wherever Commodore was, Commodore International was the big boss. Tramiel's faith in Chuck proved right. Peddle would explain to Tramiel that he felt that calculators were going to be a dead-end business very shortly. There really wasn't much more room for the technology to grow. Peddle didn't think that they could make a future for the company unless they pivoted to a different market entirely, namely home computers. Peddle had been working on something on his own. He had packaged a single-board computer design in a metal case, initially with a keyboard that used calculator keys, since those were the ones he had available. But he would later upgrade that to a full-travel, QWERTY-style keyboard like you're probably using right now if you're on a PC, as well as a monochrome monitor and a tape recorder for program and data storage, because remember, home computers used tapes. This creation would be the Commodore PET, or Personal Electronic Transactor. From its initial debut, the PET showed strong promise, and home computers would be Commodore's main focus from here on out. Now, the PET doesn't necessarily focus on any one device. There were several created, each one adding different improvements. The first one likely being the keyboard, which the original was just awful. No, seriously, the first keyboard in the PETs was trash. It was kind of one of those cash register keyboards, you know, the really stiff ones that really don't want you to type particularly fast. That would be one of the first things to be upgraded on future PETs, but they did pretty well, all things considered. They were one of the more affordable PCs of those days, being due for only $795. That's equivalent to over $4,000 today, which is, I know a lot, but again, especially in America, computers in those days were all expensive. There just wasn't any way around it unless your name was Spectrum. But that's like the exception, not the rule. Regardless, they did pretty well. In the end, selling about 219,000 units, but Commodore was just getting started in the computer field. They realized that was where the money was, and with their first line showing success, they obviously wanted to do better, because the technology was advancing, and advancing quick. In order to stay competitive, they would have to keep innovating. In 1980, they would introduce the VIC-20 in Japan. Worldwide, it was in 1981. But either way, the VIC-20 was considered a bit of a step up from the PET. It was an 8-bit home computer, and in other countries it has a slightly different designation. In Germany it was the VC-20, and in Japan it was the VIC-1001. So, whatever. But it was a computer, and is credited with being the first computer of any description to sell 1 million units. Eventually it would sell about 2.5 million. And they were able to sell it for a little less than $300, equivalent to about $1,010 today, which, actually, even in modern money, is a pretty decent price for a good computer. And that's what the VIC-20 was considered. It wasn't top of the line necessarily, but it was serviceable. And the thing about the VIC-20, perhaps more than anything else, is that it allowed people who weren't necessarily hobbyists or businessmen to afford a computer and start using it in America. The Spectrum is what did that over in the UK, but the VIC-20 did that here, as well as in a lot of other places, like Japan and Germany. The VIC was highly influential, and did go through its own variations, but once again, Commodore wasn't done. The VIC-20 may have been good, but it could be better, and in 1982, Commodore's hard work culminated in their most famous product, the Commodore 64. You were looking at, for the time, the best-selling home computer. Period, end of discussion. Some sources say it has since been surpassed, but it held that title for many, many, many years, selling somewhere between 12.5 to 17 million units. Some places didn't keep track as well as they should have. But the point is, they sold a lot of Commodore 64s. I mean a lot. And it remained supported from August of 1982 to April of 1994. Introduced at a price of a little less than $600. More expensive than the VIC-20, yes, but far more capable, and for not that much extra money, as equivalent to a little over $1,880 today, which is getting up there in terms of computers, but given the technical abilities of the 64, you were getting what you paid for. It had chips that were designed by MOS, which, again, Commodore had purchased, remember. And that meant that the C64 had advanced sound and graphics for its time. Its specs and abilities, in some ways, outperformed computers that were way more expensive than it. And while it still wasn't necessarily seen as a business person's computer, it was, for a time, every person's computer. Based on those sales numbers, as you can imagine, a lot of people owned the C64, especially for video games. The C64 had a ton of video games, with abilities that did outperform a lot of its competitors. And I bet you're wondering, what outrageous, unstoppable, almighty power does the Commodore 64 possess? Behold! You know, I had a lot of people talking smack about the Spectrum, saying, oh, well, the Commodore 64 was so much better. Which, yeah, I mean, that's technically true. Also, hey, shut up. Some people couldn't afford a Commodore 64. I'm just saying. Also, yes, for 1980 standards, this was Ultra 4K resolution. Top tier. But you have to remember, it was the old days. And the Commodore 64 offered a huge game library, with varying degrees of compatibility and options. It was a good machine, and did amazingly well, as you can imagine. The existence of the C64, plus Jack Tramiel's ability to be kind of a dictator when it came to running any company he got a hold of, meant that in 1983, he decided he was going to focus squarely on market share, and he drastically cut the price of both the VIC-20 and the Commodore 64, making already fairly cheap machines even cheaper. People rushed to get a hold of them because, well, now they could afford them, and this resulted in something called the Home Computer War. It was basically a massive pricing war between all the various computer manufacturers. Texas Instruments, for example, would cut the price on its own TI-99 4A, and basically every company was involved, even Atari, with the exception of Apple, who weren't going to play ball like that. They were going to keep their prices the same, because they're fancy and do what they want. Commodore also got clever and started putting their computers in more mass market retailers, big box outlets like Kmart. You know how you can walk in and buy a computer from Walmart or Target now? Yeah, at one point, you didn't really see computers, full-tilt computers, in places like that. But Commodore started throwing theirs into those kind of stores, so you no longer had to go to a dedicated computer store, as you once did. This, plus the affordability of their products, helped introduce computers to a lot of people who had never considered they even needed one prior to that point. Their sales spiked, and they were tremendously successful into the 1980s. For a time, some stores were selling C64s for as little as $200, which for a machine of its caliber back then was a steal. These aggressive tactics, while they were difficult to implement, did work. It even crushed Atari's own market share. In 1984, Commodore would sell 3 times as many computers as Atari did. And it wasn't just regular people that were buying these. Even NASA bought 60 Commodore systems to help process documentation, track their equipment, employees, and other, well, NASA things. By 1984, Commodore was considered the most successful home computer company, with more than $1 billion in annual revenue and $100 million in net income. Competitors, on the other hand, were reporting large losses in the face of Commodore's dominance. And though from the outside, many considered Commodore the golden child of what the computer industry should shoot for, internally, they weren't doing so great. Jack Tramiel is a man of, well, complication, as most people are. He has his strengths and weaknesses. But remember, he handled himself very much like a dictator. This is what we're gonna do, this is how we're gonna do it because I said so. That's kind of his whole thing. With his insane cost-cutting, he wound up driving out many members of the board, who, frankly, were just kind of sick of him. In January of 1984, there was an internal power struggle between Tramiel and Gould. By this point, Gould was still the chairman of the board, and he was kind of over Tramiel's friggin' attitude. And according to Tramiel, the main issue was that Gould wanted to spend basically all they were earning. But Tramiel, because he had concocted the price-slashing scheme in the first place, was well aware that yes, they had been selling a ton of units, they weren't actually making a lot of profit on the units. The whole point of his strategy was not to net them a whole bunch of money to sit on and then spend on whenever they wanted. It was to push out the competition and then produce computers that would net them a bigger profit for the future.
To capitalism!
Gould didn't understand this, and the argument got so heated that Tramiel would leave, and went on to, go figure, run Atari, one of Commodore's competitors. But his time at Atari was not necessarily great. There's a lot to unpack there too, but that is another story. Regardless, Gould would remain chairman, and wind up replacing Tramiel with a man named Marshall F. Smith, who was a steel industry executive, not a computer industry executive. In fact, Smith had absolutely no computer or consumer marketing experience at all. This would start a chain of events that would eventually lead to Commodore's just implosion, because Gould may have been the money guy, but when it came to running a company, at least in terms of Commodore, Tramiel seemed to know what he was talking about. With no one to stop him, Gould would proceed to start spending a lot more. This, of course, cut into the limited profits that the company was actually bringing in. And Tramiel was not the kind of person to let this sort of thing slide. He was pretty angry about being removed from his position after he was the one that had brought them to such success. As I said, he would eventually wind up over at Atari. He would in fact buy their Atari's consumer division from Warner Communications in July of 1984. Tramiel's allies from Commodore actually would jump ship and follow him over to the newly founded Atari Corporation to work for him again because, well, regardless of his dictatorial strategies, he knew how to run a business, or so they believed. This back and forth between Tramiel's Atari and the remains of Commodore would result in some lawsuits due to accusations of trade secrets being stolen and things like that. But, y'all need to stop being babies is really where I'm at with it. Commodore realized they were suddenly in some trouble and decided the best thing to do was to buy another company. Yeah, that's what you needed to do. You needed to spend a whole bunch of money. That was a great call. Good work. This particular company was a startup company called Amiga Corporation in August of 1984 for $25 million. This resulted in Amiga being a subsidiary of Commodore. Interestingly, this decision might have been a way to spite Tramiel because Amiga had a pretty deep history with Atari. Commodore buying them would result in them canceling any outstanding contracts, including the one that still stood with Atari. Tramiel would countersue over this, and that whole thing would last several years. It was a bit of a mess. But regardless, what you need to know is that Commodore did retain ownership over Amiga, and they would soon introduce a new 32-bit computer design called the Amiga 1000 for just $1,295. That's equivalent to about $3,600 today, which actually isn't that bad, given this was supposed to be a high-end personal computer. It was the first in what was known as the Amiga line, and there'd be a whole string of Amigas produced. But the thing about the Amiga line, particularly the 1000, is that it was very ahead of the time. Remember, this was 1985, and if you look at it, it looks like a mid-90s computer. And yeah, it had a lot of features we take for granted now, and was really good at multitasking, which I'm sure if you have a, well, normal computer at home, You actually might be multitasking on it right now. What are you doing? Did you tab out of me? Are you just listening to my voice? I am making footage for this. You could be watching now. Instead, you're on Facebook, I bet. Yeah, called you out. Gotcha. The real problem was timing here. The Amiga was pretty cool, but the industry had shifted over to Intel-based x86 computers using Microsoft Windows, which I bet you're all still using right now, unless you're on a Mac, because Apple was the only one to survive this shift. Amiga didn't, and Commodore and Atari started watching their overall market shares dwindle. The other problem with Commodore is that they had kind of a bad reputation with both dealers and customers. It's the problem because they had alienated a lot of dealers with their earlier strategies under Tramiel. But with the introduction of the Amiga 2000, they started wanting to use accredited dealers again, not just any store, anywhere, as with the Commodore 64. They never really had good relationships with dealers, and a lot of them didn't trust them nor want to work with them. And a lot of their software was seen as relatively mediocre. There were other better options. Commodore had a habit of cannibalizing the market share of their own products with their new products. This was a nightmare for dealers who had already bought the stuff, and now there was a new product that they had to get, but they hadn't sold the old one. Commodore, unlike companies like Compaq, didn't honor the returns of those old products quite as readily. It was the dealer's problem, not Commodore's, don't be silly. But this made many dealers just not work with them at all, and it meant when they tried to shift over to only using authorized dealers, there just weren't that many of those. And the top brass was a mess, a complete mess during the Amiga years. Remember I mentioned Marshall F. Smith, the guy who was from the steel industry? Well, after showing up to replace Tramiel, he then left the company in 1986, after just a year. Then his successor, Thomas Radigan, also left in just a year in 1987. This pattern of CEOs being hired, doing some stuff, and then leaving was a continuous thing. They couldn't get anyone that stuck, and it was probably because Gould kept hiring CEOs that had no experience with computers. They were from basically any other industry but that. Like the one you should get? No. We'll hire from here, or here, or here. Not computers, though. That would make far too much sense. The Commodore 64 was still selling and helping keep the company afloat, but that wasn't gonna last forever. The technology was aging, and it was gonna get to a point where either everyone that wanted one already owned one, or there were other options at the same price that could do way more. And they just kinda couldn't shake the fact that people saw them as a low-market, cheap computer manufacturer. That's kind of what they were mostly known for. But with the Amigas, they were trying more high-caliber stuff, but no one really trusted them for that. They trusted them with cheap stuff, but not this high-end situation. As the PC platform moved forward, they stopped being able to update the Amiga as quickly as they should have. The Amiga 2000 used a 7.14 MHz 68,000 CPU. But while they were still selling those, they also had the Amiga 3000 with a 25 MHz 68030 on the market. But even at that same time, Apple's offerings were using the 68040. That's just one example. Pretty much every other competitor's offerings offered performance that was better than Commodore. Plus, the Amigas, technically speaking, weren't seen originally when they were designed as a business-oriented PC line. They were meant for gaming at first. And that meant they had high performance with graphics and sound, but none of that really mattered to MS-DOS-based word processing and data processing requirements. It didn't need all that stuff for that. They did try to introduce a range of PC-compatible systems that were designed by their German division, but the price they put them out for, combined with the specifications, meant that they were a fairly average device, not something that everyone was necessarily interested in. Though they did pretty well in Germany, their share of the American market had fallen to just 6% as of 1989. They attempted to innovate, developing new chipsets in the early 1990s, and that was great, but they were losing money, and funding problems meant they couldn't materialize these brand new chipsets in time for it to matter. And even on the gaming side of things, they were starting to suffer. Consoles had shoved out a lot of the computers when it came to gaming. And the newer consoles were not only cheaper, but could well outperform a Commodore 64 by the 90s. And at no point could any of the default Amigas handle things like Doom and Wolfenstein 3D, meaning that as games developed and got more advanced, the Amiga line was left in the dust. Actually, though, I'm fairly certain you could make a version of Doom that would run on an Amiga. I mean, Doom runs on everything. I'm sure it's been done, actually, now that I think about it. But regardless, they still tried to do what they could, and in 1993, they launched a 32-bit CD-ROM-based game console called the Amiga CD32. Oh yeah, it was awful. The CD32 was absolute trash. Probably one of, if not the, worst video game consoles ever released. They sold very few, and did not, in fact, bail out the company in any way. But what the heck are the suits doing? Surely somebody at the top knew what they were doing. Well, a few, I think, knew what they were doing. But it wasn't trying to run the company into success. It was just trying to line their own pockets and run. By 1989, the CEO was a man named Mehdi Ali, a former executive over at General Motors and Pepsi. So not computers. Okay. Ali introduced a whole bunch of strategic errors that involved them not managing the computer market at all or handling anything. But remember those chipsets that they were working on? Yeah, well, they might have actually got those done, except that one of the reasons they ran out of money for them is that Ali had reduced funding for essential research and development, while increasing his own pay. In 1989 alone, he earned $1.38 million. That amount increased to $2 million in 1990, excluding bonuses, which, I think if the company's doing worse, you should be paid less. I think that would be fair. But I guess life's not fair like that. Gould, of course, saw his own salary increase by 40% to $1.75 million. And for reference, John Ackers, who was the CEO of IBM at the time, he only made $713,000. Ali would also manage to sabotage a very lucrative arrangement with Sun Microsystems to license Commodore hardware. Twice! And he started cutting costs in terms of supporting their own hardware. They refused to supply things like hard drives and CPU upgrades for anything in the Amiga line, which meant that even if the competition was more expensive, the company still supported what you were buying. He also oversaw the development of the Amiga 600, one of the, if not the, worst Amiga products. It was supposed to be a lower-cost version of the 500, but it launched with fewer features, which was part of the plan, hence lower cost, but for a higher price. And he flooded shops with A600s, while at the same time not producing A500s and A1200s that people actually wanted to buy. And, like a complete and utter buffoon, he would keep cutting in to what they were spending on R&D. Research and development, especially in a rapidly changing industry, is kind of critical. You can't secure a future for the company if you're not investing in it. He wasn't. He didn't care. He was investing in his own wallet, not the company. And though they were failing before him, he drove them right into the dirt. By 1994, only Commodore's operations in Canada, Germany, and the United Kingdom still remained at least a little bit profitable. And it certainly wasn't enough to prop up a multinational company. To their credit, though, they did see the writing on the wall. And instead of fighting tooth and nail to stay alive, they decided to, frankly, give up. They literally threw in the towel. They announced voluntary bankruptcy and liquidation on April 29th, 1994. The plan here, given their situation, actually makes sense. Basically, while they still were worth something, they were going to sell off all they could in order to pay back their creditors and probably take some for themselves and then run away. Given how large Commodore was, their assets wound up just all over the place. It's actually really hard to keep track of exactly where each of their assets went. Though, it is worth mentioning that not a single descendant company that came out of the liquidation was able to repeat Commodore's early success. They would not go on to suddenly magically be amazing. Subsidiaries like Commodore UK and Commodore BV, which was the Netherlands, both survived the initial bankruptcy. They would both stay in business by selling old inventory off, as well as making computer speakers and other types of peripherals, not computers themselves. Commodore BV would dissolve in early 1995, and Commodore UK went into liquidation on August 30th that same year. Escom AG, a German computer company, were the ones that got a hold of the primary assets of Commodore International, and they divided Commodore and Amiga into two separate divisions. Amiga became Amiga Technologies, and Commodore was used as a brand name on a lot of PCs that was sold over in Europe. But they had way too much faith in the name recognition. They overexpanded quite a bit and declared bankruptcy themselves on July 15, 1996. They were also liquidated. Escom's Dutch arm, Escom BV, actually survived that bankruptcy too, and they purchased the Commodore brand from their bankrupt parent. They would then rename themselves to Commodore BV, having no affiliation with the aforementioned Commodore BV that went out of business in '95, remember. I know this is getting very confusing, just follow me on this. And as for Amiga Technologies, they would be acquired by Gateway 2000 in March of 1997. Now, I will say there is more to it than that. The brand changed hands multiple times, like a lot. And a lot of the stuff went literally all over the place, but I think you have the basic foundation. The point is, the original Commodore was now gone. Finito. It's over. And it was their own friggin' fault. They screwed up so much, and the most frustrating part is that they didn't have to screw up any of it. Had they handled Amiga better, and maybe not gotten rid of Tramiel, things might have been different. Tramiel is his own kettle of fish and has his own problems, but he did make them a household name. And it seems like they had no vision or direction after he was gone. Upper management became more of a revolving door, and one of their last CEOs basically took the company for all they were worth and didn't make them any money. He just took his pay, which he himself increased, and then was like, alright, my work here is done. Bye-bye! Commodore could still be a thing. They were on top of the world for a while, and yet they're nothing more than a memory now. Well, that memory is very nostalgic, and it has been profited on since then, particularly with the Commodore 64. In much the same way as the ZX Spectrum, the Commodore 64 is one of those old-school home computers that has a huge cult following in the retro gaming scene. And there have been multiple reimaginings, rebadgings, or straight-up clones of the C64 in the years since. Even a few of its games wound up on the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console service in Europe and North America, though they would be delisted in August of 2013. However, perhaps in recent times, the most well-known example is the C64. That's literally what's called, the C64, or THEC64, if you actually pronounce it phonetically. There's also the C64 Mini. This was an unofficial Linux-based console that emulated the Commodore 64 in tiny bite-sized form. It released in 2018, and a full-size version was released in 2019. I'm not too overly familiar with those, but I know the Mini was at least somewhat well received, as, well, it was a plug-and-play system, and it did emulate and play old C64 games. So, you know, that's kind of what people wanted it for. My point is, there's still a market for these sorts of small, retro-style systems, and for that, we have Commodore to thank. And for basically nothing else, but for that, we have them. And maybe there's something we don't know. Maybe they did their best. And I guess your best wasn't good enough. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Rotor Videos, Lord Off 444, iSurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Josh Johnson, Caleb Rainwaters, Perez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Delinsky, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben Mikola, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mark Holding, Mr. Terrevel, Hayden DeGrow, Bad Train Puns are Best, Kurt Forkum, Harry, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, DeRoushi, A Person 723, William Nemo, Dr. Racer 78, Shimasu, Metal for Life Guy, Andrew Bowen, Crimson Rose, Ryan Wehofer, Zintac M, Boss K, Orange Glass, Andy, Ohio Trucker 1, Windy City Rails, John Videola, Extra Special J, Bob Kondirk, Jared Brussel, Levi Anderson, Darrell Williams, DE Ultra, Connor Hahn, AJNH86, Brian Philly, Murder Jones Doll, Nathaniel Brown, Robert Baldessari, Liam Wright, Mr. Sleepy, AET Museum, Jonathan Coco, NJ1969, Zendog, Rashad Austin, Wes Most, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.